few African Americans who are stigmatized as not really belonging there, right? But it's the environment itself. You set up a society in which, for centuries, you've allocated privilege on racial lines, and that society's environment will seem to confirm that race is real, because you can move from an elite white space like my university, and you can walk across this campus, and then you can enter into a nice neighborhood, overwhelmingly white, and then you can walk a few more blocks into a poor neighborhood, and it's overwhelmingly people of color. And you don't have to say a word about race or about biology for your mind to be thinking, race is real. Race says something real about people's capacity, about people's position in society, right? So our culture and our environment and our minds conspire to encourage us to think in racial terms. We know from social psychology that people are hardwired to think in terms of group differences, in groups and out groups. We know also that that doesn't have to be race, but in societies that have been structured in terms of race, where race is one of the most socially salient categories, people will think in racial terms, right? So people are always thinking in racial terms because of the culture, because of the environment, because of our unconscious minds. These are the folks who are receptive to racial pandering, who hear these coded messages, because the coded messages resonate because the stereotypes are part of how they think about the world, right? So that's routine racism. This is the audience. This is Donald Trump's audience, steeped in routine racism. This is Donald Trump. Strategic racism. What's strategic racism? Strategic racism is the decision to use racial hostility or animus in others for your own benefit. Right? Strategic racism is Barry Goldwater, it's Richard Nixon, it's Mitt Romney, it's Donald Trump, it's a lot of the consultants for the Republican Party, it's Fox News. I don't know if you are ever unfortunate enough to watch Fox News. Fox News is all about racial fear. Its audience is over 90% white, and all it does is talk about threats from the new Black Panther Party, threats from Muslims, threats from an unsecure southern border. It's all about racial fear. Is it an accident? It's a strategy. This is the Republicans in 1963 saying, we will try and use race to win votes. Right? And I want you to think for a minute here. What I'm saying the way race works today, it's not just a vestige of yesterday. It's not that we had racism 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and now we need to deal with the effects. Shit, that would be easy. Right? If all of us were committed to dealing with the effects, we'd deal with it. It's that today and tomorrow, there are people who think if I increase racism in society, I can win power. I can gain power by increasing racism. And they have made the strategic decision that they will do what they can to stoke racial fear and hatred in our society. Right? That is to say, we like to think about racism as if racism is in the past. And that yes, there were some bad racist slave owners, but they're long dead. And what I'm saying is, there are some bad racists today. Right? What makes the bad racist? Not the bigotry. I mean, yeah, there's skinheads, I got that, and they're messed up too. But the really dangerous people are the strategic racists. The ones who decide to increase racism out of a cold calculation that they can use this to win power. This is my last slide, and I'll stop after this, but this is my sort of, what do we have to do, kind of a slide. Speak out against racism. I mean more than speak out against old-style bigotry. That's easy. Everybody does that, right? I mean, you know, if somebody says something egregious and uses a racial slur, fine, we all speak out against it. We need to speak out against coded racism. We need to break that code. I said Democrats decided in 1970, realized in 1970 race could be used against them. and they said, this is going to blow over, we're going to stay silent. Right? Democrats have either imitated coded racism or stayed silent for over 50 years. And it hasn't gone away. Right? You cannot stay silent in the face of coded racism. Here's where we are now. We live in a society in the United States, and I think increasingly in Europe, that is constantly bombarded by racial talk. We're talking about race all the time, except we're talking about it in code. Right? And the conservatives, more than anybody else, are talking about race. And now we progressives are saying, I don't want to talk about race because it gets people upset, so I'm just going to stay silent. As if the result is no one's talking about race, but in fact it means that there's only one group talking about race. The group that's stoking racial fear. Right? So we have to speak out against racism, against coded racism. What happens if you speak out against coded racism? Well, you may convince people, you may not. But the social science is actually really interesting on this. By talking about coded racism, you help people, you trigger conscious thought about whether people are being manipulated by race or not. And the effectiveness of coded racism goes down once it's challenged. But it has to be challenged explicitly. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, integrate racial and economic justice. Here's what I mean. I started this talk by saying most people who talk about race are talking about bad things that happen to communities of color. This is actually a little bit tricky because the right is saying, hey, liberals, liberal government, liberal institutions like universities, labor unions, they all care more about minorities than they care about majorities. And if we start talking in terms of race only in terms of what's happening to people of color, then many whites react to this by saying either, I don't care, not really my deal, or by saying, I guess that's right, I guess these liberals really do care about people of color more than they care about me. Right? So we can't have a race conversation that's just about bad things happening to communities of color. We have to have a race conversation that says to whites, you ought to care about race because it's your children, it's your pension, it's your job, right? It's your government. Right? It's a conversation that says to whites, racism is bad for you. And if we can get that message across, then we can have a fuller conversation about race. So we have to talk about race not just in terms of the severe damage to communities of color, but to what it's doing to whites as well. Last, we need to integrate society. And what I mean by that is not that we need to homogenize it. We don't all need to be the same. But to the extent that there are major divisions in our society that can be easily harnessed through a politics of fear and resentment, you can bet that that's what some politicians will do. Right? The only way to defeat this sort of politics of fear and resentment, ultimately, is to create a new sense of the society. One in which there is an integrated sense of all of us having a shared human connection across race lines, across lines of religion, across lines of nation. Right? That sort of integration is the only sort of long-term solution to this sort of poison politics. All right, I'll stop there. And I'm happy to take questions.